On Friday, March 24th, 1944, the forest outside Sagan in German-occupied Poland is cold, dark, and almost completely still. Inside Stalag Luft III, the lights of the prisoner of war compound cast pale rectangles across the snow and frozen ground. Beyond the barbed wire, German sentries move along their patrol routes. Somewhere in the darkness, a searchlight sweeps across the camp. Inside one of the wooden huts, men are waiting. They have spent almost a year preparing for this night. There are forged identity papers hidden beneath clothing. Civilian suits have been assembled from whatever material the prisoners could obtain. Maps have been copied. Compasses have been concealed. Routes through Germany have been studied and memorized. Some men are expected to travel by train. Others will walk. Every person has been assigned a place in the escape order. But none of that matters unless the tunnel reaches the forest. The tunnel is called Harry. At about 10:30 in the evening, the first prisoner begins to crawl through the narrow passage. It is barely wide enough for a man to move along on his stomach. The air is stale. The wooden supports press close on either side. Above him are several meters of German soil. Behind him, dozens of other prisoners are waiting. The plan is extraordinary. 200 men have been selected to escape. If everything goes according to schedule, they will emerge outside the compound, cross the ground between the camp and the trees, disappear into the darkness, and scatter across Germany. But the tunnel is slightly too short. Its exit is not where the men expected it to be. Instead of emerging safely beneath the cover of the forest, it opens beside a road, exposed to the camp and the guards. The first men crawl out and run. Others follow. For a time, it works. Then, as the 77th man reaches the exit, a German guard notices movement. The alarm is raised. The Great Escape has begun, and already it is becoming something very different from what its planners intended. By the time the operation ends, 76 Allied prisoners will have made it out of the tunnel. 73 will eventually be recaptured. 50 of those men will be murdered by the Gestapo on Adolf Hitler's orders. Only 3 will successfully reach Allied territory. The escape will therefore be remembered not simply as a triumph, but as one of the most tragic episodes of the Second World War. Yet the remarkable thing is that it worked at all. Because Stalag Luft III had been designed specifically to stop men doing exactly what these prisoners were attempting. The camp had been established near Sagan, partly because its sandy soil was thought to make tunneling difficult. The ground was unstable, the sand was pale and easy to detect, and prisoners could not simply throw excavated earth into a convenient pile without attracting attention. The camp itself was surrounded by fences, guard towers, and patrols. Beneath the surface, German authorities had even installed microphones intended to detect the sound of digging. For an ordinary prisoner, escape might have seemed almost impossible. But the men inside Stalag Luft III were not ordinary prisoners. Many were trained RAF officers and Allied airmen who had already survived combat. They understood aircraft, navigation, engineering, communications, and logistics. More importantly, they understood that captivity did not have to mean passivity. Escaping was not merely a personal adventure. Under the military culture of the period, it was considered a duty. Every German guard forced to search for a fugitive was a guard removed from another task. Every false identity document, railway journey, and suspicious sighting consumed German resources. Every successful escape created uncertainty. And the prisoners had already demonstrated that the camp could be penetrated. Earlier escape attempts had taught them what worked and what failed. Some tunnels had been discovered before completion. Others had collapsed. Guards had become increasingly alert. The Germans knew the prisoners were digging, and the prisoners knew that the Germans knew. The answer was not simply to dig one tunnel, it was to dig 3. The plan was organized under the leadership of Royal Air Force Squadron leader Roger Bushell, a South African-born pilot and barrister known inside the camp as Big X. Bushell understood that an escape involving dozens or even hundreds of men could not depend on improvisation. It required organization on a military scale. 3 tunnels were planned and given deliberately ordinary names: Tom, Dick, and Harry. The names concealed their purpose. More importantly, the existence of 3 tunnels meant that the discovery of one would not necessarily expose the others. Tom was begun in a hut and extended towards the forest. Dick was planned in another direction. Harry was eventually constructed beneath Hut 104. The work was slow. Men had to remove sand without leaving evidence. They had to prevent the tunnel walls from collapsing. They needed timber for supports. They needed lighting. They needed air. And every piece of material had to come from somewhere inside a prison camp where nothing could simply be purchased. The prisoners became engineers, carpenters, miners, surveyors, and manufacturers. Bedboards were used for structural support. Electrical wiring was obtained from the camp. Prisoners adapted tins and other objects into tools. The quantity of material eventually consumed by the tunneling operation was extraordinary. The post-war camp history recorded hundreds of beds, thousands of towels, thousands of pieces of cutlery, lengths of electrical wire, and hundreds of feet of rope being diverted into the escape infrastructure. But the greatest problem was the sand. The tunnel had to disappear underground, but the sand had to disappear from the tunnel. The prisoners solved this with one of the most ingenious techniques of the entire operation. A man would crawl through the tunnel carrying a small bag or pouch filled with sand. Once outside, he would release it discreetly. The pale sand scattered across the darker ground in tiny quantities, making detection far more difficult than dumping a large pile beside a hut. It was a simple idea, and it depended upon hundreds of acts of discipline. One mistake could expose everything. Inside the tunnel, the men had to work in darkness and cramped conditions. Air was a constant problem. The deeper the tunnel became, the more difficult it was to breathe. Timber supports had to be fitted along the walls and roof. A narrow railway system was developed to move excavated sand through the passage. Lighting was improvised. The tunnel was effectively becoming a miniature underground construction project beneath the feet of the guards. Harry eventually reached a length of roughly 102 meters and was approximately 7 meters below the surface. It was not a modern tunnel. It was a fragile passageway held together by salvaged materials and human ingenuity. The prisoners also needed something just as important as engineering. They needed time. The escape could not begin whenever the tunnel was finished. Weather, moonlight, guard routines, and the movement of prisoners all mattered. A bright moon could expose men crossing open ground. A storm might create noise but could also make movement difficult. The escape had to begin when the conditions offered the best possible chance. Meanwhile, another operation was taking place above ground. Hundreds of prisoners were involved in preparing the escape. Some forged documents. Others made civilian clothing. Some produced maps. Others worked on disguises or planned railway journeys. Escape equipment had to be distributed without revealing the scale of the operation. The first men were expected to travel through Germany using trains and forged identities. Others would use workmen's trains. Some would travel on foot. The escape, therefore, did not end at the tunnel. The tunnel was only the beginning. For every prisoner who emerged, there had to be a second plan. Where to go, how to travel, what name to use, what story to tell, and how to avoid German police. This was why the operation required so many people. The tunnel itself was a remarkable engineering achievement, but the escape was also an enormous exercise in organization. Around 600 prisoners had been involved in work connected with Harry. 200 were selected for the actual escape. Their clothes, papers, money, food, maps, and compasses were prepared in advance. The first groups were even given the documents required to appear legitimate when traveling by train. Then came the night of March 24th. The camp is quiet. Inside Hut 104, the escape begins. Men move into position according to their assigned order. The tunnel entrance is concealed. One by one, prisoners descend. The first man reaches the far end. He climbs towards the surface. The exit shaft has been dug beneath the ground outside the compound, but the tunnel has not reached the forest as intended. Instead, it emerges in an exposed area. There is no time to rebuild it. The men must go. One disappears into the darkness, another follows, then another. For the prisoners still inside, the wait must be agonizing. Every minute increases the possibility of discovery. The tunnel can only move people out at a certain speed. If the guards notice something, the entire operation will collapse. 76 men eventually escape through Harry. Among them is Roger Bushell. He emerges and begins the next stage of his journey with Bernard Scheidhauer. Their intention is to reach safety through France, but the German transport system becomes part of the danger. On March 26th, they are arrested at Saarbrücken, roughly 800 kilometers from the camp. 3 days later, while being transported by car, they are murdered by Gestapo officers. The official German explanation claims they were shot while attempting to escape, but surviving evidence does not support that account. Elsewhere, the other escapees are moving through the German countryside. Some attempt to reach railway stations, others hide, some travel in civilian clothes, others depend upon forged documents and carefully prepared stories. But the alarm has spread. German police and military units begin searching. The escapees are no longer simply prisoners. They are fugitives moving through a country at war. And the same railway network that could carry them towards freedom can also carry information about them in the opposite direction. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The escape now becomes a race between preparation and circumstance. 3 men eventually succeed. Norwegian pilots Jens Müller and Per Bergsland make their way to neutral Sweden. Dutch pilot Bram van der Stok reaches the Netherlands and eventually escapes to Allied territory. For the other 73, the freedom gained outside the wire lasts hours, days, or weeks before German forces recapture them. Then comes the darkest part. 50 recaptured prisoners are selected for execution. The murders are not battlefield deaths. They are deliberate killings of prisoners who have already been captured. The men are taken away in groups and shot. German authorities attempt to disguise the crime by claiming that the prisoners were killed while trying to escape again. The British investigation after the war establishes that this explanation is false. The killings become one of the major consequences of the Great Escape, transforming the event from a remarkable escape attempt into a war crimes case. The scale of the operation becomes clearer when compared with other Allied escape efforts. The Great Escape was not the first mass breakout attempted by prisoners of war, and it was not the only Allied escape operation of the war. Prisoners across occupied Europe repeatedly dug tunnels, forged documents, bribed guards, cut fences, and exploited weaknesses in German security. What made Stalag Luft III different was the combination of scale, preparation, and technical sophistication. The camp had been specifically designed to make tunneling difficult. The sandy ground that was intended to frustrate prisoners instead became part of the challenge they learned to manage. The Germans had security measures, but the prisoners responded with countermeasures. There was no single miracle invention. There was a system. One man worked on surveying, another carried sand, another forged a document, another repaired a support, another memorized a railway route, another made clothing, another waited patiently for his turn. The escape succeeded because hundreds of small tasks were coordinated into one enormous operation. That is also why the Hollywood version of the story requires caution. The famous 1963 film created memorable characters and dramatic episodes, but it changed major details. The real escape was overwhelmingly an Allied prisoner operation involving British and Commonwealth personnel and other Allied airmen, not the largely American-led adventure portrayed on screen. Steve McQueen's famous motorcycle sequence is cinematic invention. The real escapees did not race across the countryside on motorcycles. The historical reality is quieter and, in many ways, more extraordinary. The men did not have cinematic freedom. They had forged papers, borrowed clothes, railway tickets, and a dangerous knowledge of German geography. They had no guarantee that the next railway station would be safe, no guarantee that the next German policeman would believe their story, no guarantee that the weather would protect them, and no guarantee that the people they encountered would help them. The three successful escapees demonstrate how narrow the path to freedom really was. Bergsland and Müller eventually reached Sweden, a neutral country. Van der Stock traveled through occupied Europe with the assistance of resistance networks before reaching safety. For most of the others, the German search system proved too extensive. The escape, therefore, cannot honestly be described as an unqualified success. It achieved something remarkable, but it failed in its ultimate objective for the overwhelming majority of the men involved. That distinction matters. The prisoners had planned for 200 men to escape. 76 got out. Only 3 reached freedom. 50 were murdered. The remaining 23 recaptured prisoners survived the war. Measured purely as an escape operation, the result was catastrophic. Measured as an act of resistance, however, the story becomes more complicated. The prisoners had challenged a system designed to make them powerless. They had built an underground railway beneath the camp. They had removed roughly 80 tons of sand during the later stages of construction, according to the Royal Air Forces Association, while keeping the excavation concealed from German guards. They had created an operation involving hundreds of people without allowing the entire plan to collapse under its own weight. And for a brief period on the night of March 24th, the wire that represented German control was no longer an absolute barrier. The escape also had consequences beyond the 76 men who left. After the breakout, German authorities intensified security around prisoner-of-war camps. The murders produced outrage in Britain and among the Allied governments. Investigators later traced responsibility for the killings, and German personnel involved were prosecuted after the war. The escape itself became part of the historical record through prisoner testimonies, reports, and the surviving camp history. The site of Stalag Luft III no longer looks like the wartime prison that the men knew. The original camp was later dismantled, and parts of its structures disappeared. Yet the landscape around Jagan still contains physical traces and memorials associated with the prisoners. Museum collections preserve documents and objects connected with the escape. Archives preserve reports produced by the men themselves. The National Archives holds the extensive post-war material documenting the escape and the investigation into the murders. These records matter because the Great Escape has lived for decades between history and mythology. The mythology gives us a clean story. The prisoners dig, the tunnel opens, the heroes escape, the villains chase them, the heroes survive. The real story is harder. The tunnel does open, but it opens in the wrong place. The men do escape, but most are captured. The mastermind gets out, but he is murdered. And the prisoners who believed they were fighting for freedom discover that the most dangerous part of an escape can begin after the wire has disappeared behind them. That is what makes the final image so powerful. Return to the night of March 24th, 1944. The forest is dark, the ground is cold. A man has just climbed out of the tunnel. Behind him, somewhere underground, another prisoner is waiting. There is no cheering crowd, no motorcycle, no sweeping orchestral music, only the sounds of men breathing, boots moving across the ground, and the distant presence of German guards. The prisoner runs. He runs because there is nowhere else to go. Behind him lies the camp. Ahead lies Germany. Somewhere beyond Germany lies freedom. For a few moments, that freedom seems possible. Then the alarm begins. The searchlights come on. The German guards realize what has happened, and the greatest escape attempt of the war begins to collapse. Yet the significance of Stalag Luft III was never contained simply in the number of men who reached the other side of the wire. The deeper achievement was that prisoners, under conditions designed to break their independence, created an organization capable of functioning beneath the very system imprisoning them. They turned beds into timber. They turned scraps into tools. They turned sand into a problem that could be managed. They turned civilian clothing into identities. They turned pieces of paper into movement. And they turned a prison camp into a place from which escape was possible. The tunnel called Harry was only about 100 meters long, but for the men who built it, those 100 meters represented an enormous distance between captivity and possibility. Every meter required labor. Every support required material. Every handful of sand required concealment. Every forged document carried risk. Every prisoner who knew the plan carried another risk. And yet the plan survived. It survived discovery. It survived shortages. It survived fear. It survived the constant possibility of betrayal, accident, or collapse. The records do not support every later legend surrounding the escape. There have been claims that Allied prisoners betrayed the operation to the Germans, but historians continue to debate such allegations, and there is no firm evidence establishing that betrayal as the decisive cause of the escape's failure. The documented explanation is much less dramatic. The tunnel emerged short of its intended woodland cover, the alarm was raised when the 77th man was seen, and the German security apparatus was eventually able to recapture most of the men. That version needs no embellishment. It is already extraordinary. The Great Escape was not a story in which ingenuity defeated tyranny completely. It was a story in which ingenuity created a narrow opening in a system built to prevent escape. 3 men reached freedom. 73 were captured. 50 were murdered. Those numbers should remain together because separating the triumph from the tragedy would distort what actually happened. The escape succeeded because the tunnel was completed.